Hi, this is Doug Bradley, Pinhead from the Hellraiser movies, and you are listening to Without Your Head. And you'd better keep listening to Without Your Head, or you will not only be without your head, you will be without your soul, because I will tear it apart.
Welcome to the Station of Decapitation, WithoutYourHead.com. I am Nasty Neil.
And I am Annabelle Lecter.
Yes, and this is Hellraiser month, and now we are joined by special effects artist who worked on Hellraiser and Hellbound, Cliff Wallace.
Hello.
Hello, how are you doing?
Good, thank you.
Excellent. Now, first of all, how did you get involved in Hellraiser?
Well, I was working on a film, another Clive Barker film actually, called Rawhead Rex, which is a film that not many people will admit to seeing, and fewer people will admit to working on. And while I was there, one of the mold makers there told me there was this other film that Clive Barker was planning on doing called Hellraiser, and that maybe I should get in contact with the guy who was in charge of that, because I was a big Clive Barker fan. You know, I'd read all the books of blood, and I was really excited that there were films being made of his stuff. So the chap who was in charge was a guy called Bob Keane, and I rang him up and said, look, I haven't done much work, but I've got a little portfolio. Can I come and show it to you? And I did, and a few months later I was working on Hellraiser.
Very cool. Now, when you met Clive Barker, and you guys, what were you like right on the same page about bringing some of his ideas to the screen to life?
Yeah, pretty much. I think there was a period of about 2 months, I guess, where they were trying to raise the money to make Hellraiser, and Bob Keane used to take a few of us over to Clive's house in Crouch End once a week, and we'd just sit down and talk about what the Cenobites would look like, what monsters there'd be, and Clive would draw and we'd draw, and so by the time the film actually came to fruition, we had a pretty good idea of what the Cenobites were going to look like and what Frank was going to look like. And Clive had all this reference material, which was the kind of stuff that I'd never seen before. There was Joel Peter Witkin books and things like that. And Clive sort of opened your eyes to a whole sort of new underworld of society that you didn't really know existed out there. All the sort of underground piercing clubs and things like that were beginning to appear. All those were kind of fed into the mix.
Yeah. Now, when you're working on a film like that, would you do you prefer to work with someone who really has a lot of input and ideas, specifically what they want to see in the movie, or would you rather have all off your own creativity?
Well, it kind of depends whether they have good ideas or not.
Well, there you go. Yeah.
I mean, the thing about movies these days is that there's so many people who are having an input into the design of a creature, who are looking for validation. And it might not just be the director and the producer, but it might go right down to the people who are making the toys that go in the Happy Meals that are advertising the film. So often you start with designs and they get so watered down by the time the film comes out. Obviously that didn't happen with Clive, and it didn't really happen in the early 80s when makeup effects films were just sort of beginning to catch on. It was kind of like the rock and roll, and you were gods. You had a big say in what things look like. It's not so much that now.
Now, is that because there's just so many more artists and it's so much more competitive, and people are willing to cave to this creativity that other people are trying to get you to do basically what their ideas are and not so much what you want?
It's partly that, but the game's changed over the last sort of 30 years or so. When Hellraiser was being made, makeup effects were relatively new, and people were making movies specifically to showcase makeup effects. Now, of course, these days makeup effects is just a small part of the film. and it's not as an important a part. It's just part of the tools of filmmaking, you know. So I'd say our role definitely has lessened over the years.
And I talked a little bit with Tom Savini once, and he
Right.
said like that was really the era that he had the most fun, because you were not only making things, but you were creating how they were created. And later on, there's different ways, how you go about doing it. But was that fun for you to actually come up with like different techniques?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, and specifically on Hellraiser, it was a very young crew that Bob Keane had assembled. I think there was about 10 or 11 of us, and for most of us, it was our first or second film, and we were just a bunch of kids having fun, really, and Bob would just say, if you want to try something, just go for it, and if it works, we'll use it. So it was a fantastic thing to be involved with, and the fact that Clive was such a powerhouse and such a cool guy to be around didn't harm either.
Yeah.
So what kind of discoveries did you make? Some real memorable experiences and learning what you were doing and creating new techniques?
Well, for me personally, I mean, I'd never done anything bigger than a head. And most of the things I've been making, I've been sort of cooking in my mum's oven. So I'd never done a multi-piece makeup or a big suit like I did on Hellraiser before. So it was a huge learning curve, for me, certainly. There were some very sort of talented people around in the makeup effects crew on Hellraiser. But as I said, for most of us, it was our first or second film, and the talent was pretty embryonic, certainly in my case.
Yeah.
I really hadn't done a great deal of work. But, I think what Bob Keane saw in me was probably, a real drive to learn and to, and quite a good imagination as well. I mean, I really wanted to be a writer. That was my first love, and that's how I'd come across Clive and his writing. So that was sort of really cool, and we were having an input into in some ways the story as well.
So when you started out getting into this kind of art, what was your background before then? And were you drawn more to horror? You said you were reading Clive Barker, but was that the direction you were hoping to go in?
Sure. I mean, I'd always been sort of interested in the fantastique, I guess. Obviously Hammer Films in England. A guy called Jerry Anderson who used to do puppet shows like Thunderbirds and Joe 90 and things like that. Ray Harryhausen, obviously. I used to make Aurora horror kits. So I was very sort of interested in that. And my background really was I was at film school, and I wanted to make things with puppets in, and no one knew how to do it. And if I wanted to get my projects made when I was at film school, the only thing I could do was to say, look, I want to make this film and it's going to have these creatures in it, and produce them, So really I set about teaching myself, and I can pin it down specifically to the movie that made me want to do it. One afternoon I bunked off college to go and see a film called The Howling, which is a werewolf movie. And that came out in England, came out a couple of weeks before American Werewolf in London. And I'd read the Gary Bradner novelization that the film was based on. It was nothing like the film, but I remembered it had a really good sex scene in it, which is probably why I went to see the movie. And it was the first time that I'd actually sat in a movie theater and seen things changing on the screen. There was a guy turning into a werewolf, and it wasn't just falling down behind a
bush and then pops back up and it's all hairy.
Starts growing, absolutely. So you were seeing makeups move, and that just blew me away. And from that point on, I thought, well, this is kind of really cool, and this is something I could get involved with.
Yeah.
And there wasn't the information out there in those days. We didn't have the internet, so it was a case of just sort of reading about whatever you could find in magazines. There was occasionally an article in Fangoria or something like that. And looking at the pictures and seeing if you could work out what materials they were using. And eventually, I started writing to makeup artists when films were being shot in England. I'd write to whoever was in charge of the makeup effects, and the first person who actually answered one of my calls was Rick Baker, and I went along to see his workshop. It was on Greystoke, which was a Tarzan movie. Mm-hmm. And everything looked so complicated, and I thought, there's no way I'm never going to be able to do this for a career. And then a couple of months later, there was an English werewolf movie being made called The Company of Wolves, and I went to see Chris Tucker, who was in charge of that, and it was a completely different way of working, and I could suddenly see myself doing it as a job.
Along those lines of the transformation scene in the werewolf movies, the birth of Frank is, it's different than a lot of the other effects in the movie, because the other ones are mostly guys that, with makeup on.
Sure.
How involved was that scene to pull off?
It was pretty involved, and you probably know, right, that it wasn't shot at the same time as the rest of the movie.
I did not know that.
Okay, well, what happened was, and the reason Hellraiser is kind of like it is in this sort of strange, not quite England, not quite America setting, is because originally that scene wasn't in the movie. And New Line, who were producing the movie, New World actually, not New Line, New World, who were producing the movie, thought, well, this is a very tiny movie. It's not got much of a budget. It's going to be a sort of art house horror movie. They weren't particularly interested in it until they started seeing the rushes and saw a rough cut, and then when they saw that, they suddenly thought, oh, hold on, this could be a bit of a hit. So they put a bit more money in it to shoot that original, to shoot that burst sequence that wasn't there. Originally, Frank just fell out of a wall, and he was just bricked up behind a wall, and he just fell out of it, So that whole scene really was a new thing, and it really lifts the movie, And along with the Chris Young score that again wasn't in the original movie, that really puts the whole movie in a different light. Really.
Yeah. Now, had you watched the rough cut, before they added all these scenes, and could really tell the difference?
Yeah. It was a different movie before. Obviously, a lot of the characters in the movie, as it stands, are dubbed. Sometimes to the detriment of the performance, I think. But yeah, adding those scenes really helped the movie, definitely. Mm-hmm. And it was a great chance for the effects crew to let rip as well,
Yeah.
Now, Simon. Oh, I'm sorry. Simon and Nick were both telling us that their lines reduced dramatically because of the makeup on their faces, and
yeah.
So, and they'd said it was frustrating for everyone that you guys went through so much work to make these amazing creations, and then, okay, now what do we do? So, how was that? How did that experience go for you, and what you remember of everybody there?
Yeah, I mean, Nick obviously had the hardest time of all because he couldn't see very well, he couldn't hear, he couldn't talk, he couldn't do anything really. In fact, none of the Cenobites had names originally. There was no Pinhead, there was no Butterball, there was Chatterer. There wasn't a Chatterer. We just referred to him as poor bastard. He couldn't do anything. And in fact, I was looking at some pictures of the makeup test the other day, actually, for something else, and Chatterer didn't have the teeth that he has now, which is very strange. He had sharp, pointed teeth, which obviously he couldn't chatter with. So yeah. That whole chattering thing came much later. We changed the teeth after the makeup test, which was probably about 2 or 3 days before it started shooting.
Do you know why the female Cenobite never got a cool name? She's just the female Cenobite.
I don't really. I mean, we never really came up with a name for her. I mean, most of the names that they have were nicknames, really. And we never came up with one for her. Well, not one that was not one that's publishable anyway. She did have a sort of strange orifice in her neck. You can imagine the name she was called.
You can feel this is a very open show. You feel free to share if you
Yeah. I wouldn't feel anyway.
Yeah, I'm kind of excited right now. No, there's a.
Jeez, no.
Just kidding, quote. And but Frank has different levels of before it becomes Frank again.
Sure.
When were each one of those completely different makeup effects, or did you have to add on as he would slowly become a man?
Yeah. Well, again, the Frank that you see in the movie wasn't the original Frank that was proposed. The first stage of Frank was in fact an animatronic puppet, and we just didn't have the time to rehearse with it really, and it didn't work. So we ended up that first stage of Frank is just a sort of mask, and there's another bit where it's a kid in a suit. But the original intention was to have its first lines delivered by this animatronic puppet, which we made and which did work pretty well when we were all coordinated, but we never really were that coordinated. So that was replaced with a makeup. The second stage, which is the stage with the sort of dried out looking stage where you can see its rib cage and everything. That's the full body suit. That was always proposed. The third stage, which is the kind of red bloody makeup.
Right, suit.
That was basically applied over the base pieces of the second stage makeup.
Mm-hmm. I know that actor Oliver Brown. Then he also played Browning in Hellbound.
Yeah, Oliver Smith. Yeah.
Yeah. Was he? What was he like to work with?
He was good fun. I mean, he's very patient. He was. He's obviously very skinny.
I was gonna ask that if that's something you would look for.
He was hired. Yeah.
Yeah.
But he was very patient. We didn't. I don't think we ever took a full life cast of him. I remember assembling most of that suit on him a couple of days before we started filming, and he just used to stand there for hours while I Evo sticked these pieces to a Lycra bodysuit. And originally, I think he was supposed to shoot for 2 days, and he ended up shooting for about 2.5 weeks. So after 2 or 3 days, it was just the slime that was holding that suit together. It was not the most pleasant thing to wear, I don't think.
I can imagine.
So he was very good. The life casting process, I seem to remember, was pretty hideous for him. I remember doing his facial life cast in about 3 pieces, and having to assemble them all, and me thinking that there was no way that he was going to be able to sit there and have this makeup glued on him for hours and hours. But he was fantastic, actually. Mm-hmm. And he gives a great performance, and it's one of the things that irks me greatly about the movie is that he's been dubbed, and the American actor that does his performance actually does a really good impersonation of his performance, but just in an American accent.
Is there any original cut of that where they could take that away?
I'm sure it may exist somewhere. I have no idea where. But it was a great performance, I have to say.
You,
That
you
would be very
mentioned
interesting.
you mentioned you couldn't use the animatronics. Was there
Yeah.
any other thing like in the script that either just couldn't film because of the budget, or just maybe you didn't think it would be able to be filmed?
Shot everything that we made. In the end, there was a few. There were some different makeups, I think, in the dream sequence where Kirsty pulls the sheet off what turns out to be her father. I think there was a different makeup for that originally, but most of the stuff is there. An interesting thing about the transformation sequence and the animatronic in that is that wasn't something that was actually built for that movie. That was something that was from another movie, and we just redressed the skin. That's the one that kind of sits up at the end of the sequence.
Yeah. Does that happen often? Like you might make something for another movie and not use it, or you take something you did make for something else and kind of change it up for another film?
Yeah, sure. And in fact, a lot of the stuff that ended up in Hellbound was stuff that came out of those original design sessions for Hellraiser. Certainly the Channard Cenobite from Hellbound had pretty much been designed as an option for a Cenobite for the first movie. The whole sort of Hellraiser thing hung around for several movies afterwards. I remember we were doing some designs for a film called Dream Demon, which didn't happen with us in the end. I think they used someone else, but there were certainly some designs for that ended up in Hellraiser 3 and things like that. So yes, it does happen quite frequently.
Yeah. Were you approached to work on part 3 or any of the other sequels?
Yeah, I'd actually left Image Animation by then, but they still did the effects for part 3, which is kind of the last movie that I consider to be a Hellraiser movie. Really, I mean, that. I think a lot of them are. I think the last ones are kind of like bad cover versions of the originals.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel seeing those changes from then to the later films? Is it upsetting to see, and is it really just the way the films were made, or is it the jobs that you would have had and how they did things?
No, I mean, I think a lot of the sequels were made without a lot of the love that have been around in the first couple of movies. I mean, they were made to make money. They were made fairly cheaply. They were made without Clive's involvement or blessing. So that obviously makes a difference. I think that the interesting thing is that the later movies haven't really harmed the whole sort of Hellraiser. Mm-hmm. The original Hellraiser movies, they haven't detracted from the power of Hellraiser, or to a lesser extent Hellbound, I don't think.
No, it feels as though, I think most people that enjoy the series do feel loyal to those original films and to Clive and the cast. And
Sure,
it's very interesting because it's not just you guys knowing each other involved in it. It's people that enjoy the films as fans.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that we're talking about Hellraiser here now, and it's nearly 30 years since we made it, means I guess we must have done something right the first time around.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Was there much of a difference on the set between Hellraiser and Hellbound?
Yeah, quite a difference actually. The main one was that Clive wasn't around as much, really. And I mean, Clive had, by the time Hellbound came out, Clive had gone pretty much stellar. When Hellraiser was being made, there was, he was kind of just about about to break through. The first novel, The Damnation Game, was just about coming out. I think when we were doing Hellraiser, there was a play of one of his plays, obviously. The Secret Life of Cartoons was on in the West End, and it seemed that Clive was just on the cusp of becoming huge. By the time Hellbound came out, Hellraiser had obviously been out, and that had been a huge success. And I think Weaveworld, the sort of second novel on the the first big fantasy novel that he wrote, was just about to come out as well, and he just wasn't around as much, So that the dynamic was different. The fact that it was being made at a big film studio, at Pinewood Film Studios, and not in some little place in Cricklewood, made it feel different as well. So yeah, it was a lot different. And Bob Keane, who was in charge of the makeup effects on the first movie, was just sort of supervising on the second. He wasn't around as much as either, because he was obviously being offered bigger and better stuff. So the second film did feel slightly different from the first film. Yeah.
Do you feel like that took away from the film as compared to the first one? Because it sounds, just from the people we've spoken with, that there was such camaraderie and closeness between everybody working, that a lot of people had known each other from before the film was even made. So do you feel that comes through in the final product?
I personally don't like the second film as much. And I know a lot of people feel the same way. My personal opinion is that it was trying to be a little too big, and some of the stuff doesn't work as well as it should do.
Mm-hmm. By that you mean, you have to go into specifics, but trying to take on too much, like actually going to hell and trying to show the Leviathan and things. Absolutely,
yeah. I mean, it was, I think it was trying to do more than the budget would allow. I think if I saw both movies again a couple of weeks ago for the first time in maybe 20 years. I felt some of the opticals weren't as great as they could have been, and certainly some of the makeup effects weren't up to the standard of the first movie, I think, personally.
Yeah, I've personally been rewatching them now, because we were doing this this month here, and I did want to mention to you that in the first movie, I really think the Frank, which you brought up earlier, but the birth still really holds up well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I thought so too. When I saw it, I think there's, there was one or two things in the first movie when I saw it the other day that made me cringe a little, but generally I think it's pretty strong.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'd read an interview you did on, I think it's a Labyrinth website.
Yeah.
And you talked to, which is a great website, people should check that out. And you talked about that you guys filmed a scene that showed the origin of Chatterer, but it was cut.
Yeah. In the second movie, there's a change in the look of Chatterer. I did the Chatterer 2, as it came to be known. I don't think it's anywhere as good as the original Chatterer design, but the reason it came about really was because Nick couldn't see or hear or do anything in the first film, and he'd specifically asked that he could see if he was going to do it again in the second movie. So we had to give him eyes, and part of the story in the second film was that these people had once been humans. So we saw a chance there to take the look of Chatterer more back to being human, so he has ears and things like that. But you know, it's not a thing I'm usually proud of. But we did film a little sequence, which was basically to show that transformation from Chatterer 1 to Chatterer 2, and it was just a little sequence of things like you know, his eyes being revealed and things like that. It wasn't anything that had been thought about greatly, and it's probably not in the movie because I didn't make a very good job of it. I think I hold my hands up to that. And it was probably, you know, that when they came to edit the film, they didn't want to stop the movie for a 4-minute transformation sequence, which is kind of what it was. I mean, I honestly can't remember whether it was good or whether it was bad. To tell you the truth, it was done in such a hurry. But it is kind of strange that in the movie you see 1 minute he's Chatterer and then next minute he's Chatterer 2, and there's no explanation for that.
Yeah.
Which is a little strange.
So do you find that you are incredibly hard on yourself when you look back on your work, and do you see, I could have done it this way with the eyes? Oh, well, I had to do it. So
yeah, sure.
I mean, this different way.
Know, if you're satisfied with something as an artist, you might as well give up, frankly, you know, because you're always trying to improve on what you've done. I mean, there are things that annoy me with the Frank suit in the first movie. Like there's one scene where I just look at it and its rib cages, you know, the ribs are sticking out at funny angles and things like that. Kind of annoy me even now, 30 years later.
So because it's not anatomically correct?
Just because I obviously wasn't looking close enough at the time and didn't notice it, you know. I mean, you know, your kind of job as a makeup artist is to be standing looking at a monitor and seeing whether, you know, you can see an edge or you can see stuff that you shouldn't see. And I obviously wasn't doing it well enough on that occasion. But yeah, I mean, if you're completely happy with something, then what's the point, you know? Well, you've done the best work you can do, and I think you know, you're always striving to do better stuff as an artist. A lot of the time, you fail.
Do you feel like exhaustion plays a part? Because I know I paint and whatnot, and if I sit with something too long, I totally lose perspective on what I'm doing, and then I come back to it later and go, why didn't I just stop and take a break and then come back?
To a degree, certainly. I mean, and certainly, you know, I'm still doing this job 30 years after I started, which was a great surprise to me. You know, I thought I'd maybe do it for 2 or 3 movies at the most. And certainly, yeah, as time goes on, you think, well, I've done all this before, and you know, and I haven't really progressed much.
Well, even in the moment, like on any given film, just sitting with one piece, like if I was to sit with a painting and go for hours and hours and hours, like would you end up making Frank's ribs not quite what you want because you passed the point of being in the zone?
Sure, I'm kind of blessed in that I have blessed and cursed in that I have a really, really low boredom threshold. So I tend to work very quickly. I'm not like one of these makeup artists who sits there and sculpts every skin pore, which tends to be a thing these days. You know, I'm really sort of interested. The things that interest me in creature design are sort of elegance and form and things like that. And so it's kind of really cool that I don't have the patience to do that stuff, I think.
It is really interesting looking at your art, the sculptures that you make, because it is very smooth and looking at things as forms. And like you said, there's not every single little hair or it's very it's different.
I kind of tend to look at stuff in the same way as a fashion designer would look at it, I think, and I'm very interested in sort of silhouettes and that sort of thing, which as I say is why I like a lot of fashion design and why I like hats. You know, anything that sort of changes the architecture of the skull or the form of the body is interesting to me, far more interesting than which way a wrinkle goes or something like that.
I noticed that, but I also noticed something else in a lot of your sculptures, and that is the lack of eyes in a lot of them. And there has to be something to that.
Yeah. I never get the damn thing straight. One eye is always higher than the other. No, it's something more than that. I think it's it's often said that the eyes are the gateway to the soul and all this sort of thing. So if you take that away, you've got
there's no soul
to begin with. So it's always interesting to me to take as many of the sort of recognizable features away and see what you can come up with that still has something that can emote and that you can relate to. That's always a hard sell in movies, actually. I mean, that's why I started doing the art stuff, really, is because, as I said right at the onset of the interview, there's so many people that have an opinion on the creature design now that I think that the art stuff is really a chance to just do the stuff that I want to do and have no one else stick their oar in.
Yeah.
Yes.
You said you wanted to be a writer originally. Have you ever thought of writing a script and then writing your own monster in that? And then
sure. I went through all that. It was a deeply disturbing and unpleasant process.
Oh, well, I'm glad I brought it up.
Yeah.
Going through that, that sitting by a swimming pool in Hollywood for months on end, rewriting stuff, and having to deal with people who you didn't feel were the most creative people in the world.
And then giving their own opinion.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, was that a challenge to your patience level? Because writing is quite a process. You might have some big scenes in mind, and then filling the space between.
Yeah, sure. I mean, writing was never really a problem for me, and I've written film scripts, and I've had short stories published and things like that, and I've written some novels in my time. That's never been a problem for me to sit down and write. What is a problem for me is to find the time to sit down and write. My agent years ago, I had an agent called Dot Lumley, who was the wife of a English horror writer called Brian Lumley, who wrote the Necroscope series and things like that. She sort of very astutely put it to me that I only write when I'm really bored or really upset about things, and that's true. And I'm very happy making monsters still, and so I don't write quite as often as I used to, I think, and I'm a lot happier than I used to be.
How early did you start creating monsters? You said you're watching the Harryhausen movies, and did you do some of that kind of stuff as a child?
Only sort of model kits and things. I mean, as I said, I really didn't think about or get interested until I saw The Howling, or thinking of it as a career and actually trying to start making stuff. So that was fairly late. I mean, I was probably about 18, 19, for some kids these days, they're making stuff at 10, 11, and you're going along to sort of makeup shows and seeing 14-year-old kids with stuff that blows your shit away. It's quite different.
I'm a huge Harryhausen fan, and my favorite creation is definitely Skeleton Scene from Jason the Argonauts. Do you have a particular favorite?
I like the Cyclops, actually.
Nice.
That's probably my favorite. But that whole sort of stance, the shoulders back, head forward stance still seems to me the coolest thing. Even if you're putting someone in a suit, that's still the way they look cool. So I think it's interesting that the good CG stuff, is stuff that was done by people who were once stop motion animators, and who know how creatures move and things like that. And I think a lot of CG stuff just looks like it's moonwalking a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's something that comes up on the show. I'm sorry. It feels like there's the weight's missing in a lot of stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's kind of basic stuff, really, I think. And as
what are some of the films that stand out for you that achieve that with CGI, that actually make it work?
Well, I guess the stuff in Jurassic Park, the original, blew me away when I first saw that. And I thought, well, we're not going to have a job in 5 years. Luckily, taking a bit longer than that. Starship Troopers, I thought, was terrific. That was the next one that blew me away. There's been some great stuff since, but it always looks to me like you used to get lenticular cards in packets of cereal over here. Those 3D cards, and it always kind of looks a bit like that to me. It's there, but it's not really there,
Mm-hmm. Something else I'd wanted to ask you, what was the first time you saw your own work where there was this transformation effect on film, where you're sitting there and you see, okay, here it is, and then what was your reaction to it at the time?
Well, I mean, the first sequence of that sort that I was involved with, I guess, was the one we did for Hellraiser, and it was very simple stuff. It was generally rod puppets through the floor and things like that. A lot of reverse meltdowns and things like that, just reversing the film, destroying something, and when you play the film back, it looks like it's rebuilding itself. So it was all very simple stuff. That stuff in the burst sequence for Frank, but it kind of worked really well, and it was exciting to see that, and it's still exciting when I see films that I've been involved with now. It's still exciting to see your stuff up there on screen, and it's even more exciting if it looks good, and it's even more exciting if it looks like what you imagined it would look in the first place.
Now, with CG, I'm sure you've worked on a lot of movies that use CG, but are your techniques still, used?
Sorry?
So, how is your involvement in a movie that uses a lot of CG?
Well, a lot of the time these days we're building stuff that the CG department are using to scan to create the final creature with. Or a lot of times it's used to augment stuff. I mean, one of the films I did that I think was a really good combination of the work that we did and the work that the CG department was I did a film for Danny Boyle a couple of years ago called Trance, and there's a scene where a guy gets his head blown off, and we built an animatronic head for it. But I said to the CG department, well, it would be great if you took all the information from this head, and we did a makeup as well, and you mapped all the information from this head onto the actor along with the makeup. And when that sort of thing works, I think it works great. It's great if you get a director who's still in love with rubber stuff. It doesn't happen that often, but it's great when it does. I mean, on Hellboy 2, for example, Guillermo del Toro is obviously still in love with makeup effects, although he knows the times when he's got to use CG. So he often combines the two brilliantly, I think.
Yeah, I was going to bring up because I'm sorry that looking at your art and a lot of the Del Toro movies, I really see a similarity in like styles of the creatures. Did you feel like you're kind of on the same kind of brainwave with him?
Yeah, I think there's a reason for that, and it's because a lot of us in makeup effects drink from the same myth pool. We're all interested in the same authors. We're all interested in the same artists, and that's why I think stuff tends to look a little similar. Obviously, if you're the way that influence works is that you look at stuff on the internet or whatever, and you tend to like stuff that has elements of your stuff in it. And I know in the case of Hellboy 2, that's why Guillermo got in contact with me. He'd seen some of my personal stuff and thought, oh, well, this kind of fits in with my view of the universe, So that's kind of how that stuff works. It's very difficult these days with social media and things to do stuff that's completely new, completely different looking. That's why I try and not look so much at what other makeup artists are doing, but try and find stuff that's interesting to me in, as I've mentioned, in fashion design or in architecture or something like that. But of course, as soon as you do that and it's out there, then that feeds into the myth pool as well. So people are looking at those same things. So it's very difficult to be original in creature design these days, I think.
Who are artists and authors and designers who you respect and admire?
Artist-wise, I guess there's a guy called Wayne Barlow who years ago did a book called Expedition, and then he did a book called Barlow's Inferno. And certainly, if you look at that, you can see so many influences. Not only influences on him, but things that he's influenced. If you look at Guillermo's work, you'll certainly see elements of Barlow in there. You'll certainly see elements of another artist called Beksinski, Polish artist. If you look at his stuff, you'll see elements of Giger. If you look at Giger, you'll see elements of someone else. That's the way it works. An artist who I was particularly interested in is a guy called Chet Zar, who is again a makeup artist who turned to fine art. And to go back to Clive Barker, I think it was Clive that suggested that Chet sort of got into fine art, if that's what he wanted to do. And certainly, again, if you look at stuff in Del Toro's movies, you'll see Chet Zar's influence, and if you look at his stuff, you'll see Barker's influence. So it's kind
Chet
of
Zar is great.
Chet Zar is fantastic. Yeah. In fact, the reason that I started doing art stuff and sort of thought of art as a final sort of resting place for my pieces. Up to that point, I'd always thought the end result would either be seeing them on screen or just as a picture in your portfolio, was that Chet did a show in London about 7 or 8 years ago now, a gallery called Strychnine Gallery, which was based in Berlin, but they used to have a place in London as well. And I went along to see his pictures and got talking to this woman who it turned out owned the gallery, and she said, well, what do you do? I said, I work in movies. And she said, well, can I come along and see your etchings, and she looked at those and said, well, yeah, this is art. And it kind of is in a way, but it's obviously what we do for movies is commercial art. You're being paid to do what you're told, basically. But I'm a very strong believer in the fact that what we do is art and not just craft, And if you take it out of the context that we do it for normally and put it in an art gallery, then it becomes art.
I was really impressed by that.
Getting people to buy it, of course, is something else entirely.
Yeah. I was really impressed when I saw on your Facebook page that you actually have these sculptures of creatures was on display at a museum, an art museum. I was like, that to me is, I've never really seen that before. And what were people's impressions of that came and saw it?
Well, it's always very interesting. I mean, most of the people who like it as art tend to wear a lot of black, a lot of eyeliner.
There's nothing wrong with that.
There's always a lot of goth girls there. But no, I mean, it's, I guess it's kind of lowbrow, dark art. Is what it's classified as, but it is very interesting. Years ago, I did a show in Cologne. I did an art fair and got makeup artists to contribute pieces of art, which we showed at this art fair in Cologne, which had all sorts of art, and it was very interesting to see people's reactions there to the stuff that they wouldn't really expect to see in an art gallery. It's always interesting to hear people's reactions. Anyway, if people tend to reduce stuff to what they've seen before. If you do a creature with no eyes, then the chances are people will say it looks like something from Pan's Labyrinth. If you do an alien, the chances are they say it'll look like something from Star Wars. So you have to kind of fight against that.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you work on a non-horror movie or a movie that doesn't have creatures involved, do you still is it still fulfilling for you as an artist?
Yeah, to a certain extent. I've done a lot of movies where you're just making loads of dead bodies or loads of dead horses or something like that, and it does get repetitive and boring after a time. I think as an artist, probably the best way to approach that is to try and look to find some point of interest in the job, and that might be using a material that you've never used before, or might be doing a different approach than you've used before. And that usually helps to keep it fresh.
Mm-hmm. Are there any horror movies that you worked on that you think are underrated that people don't normally talk about, that you would like people to seek out?
There's one or two. I did a movie, a ghost story movie called The Abandoned One, which I thought was very good. It was directed by a guy called Nacho Cerda, who was a Spanish guy, and it was written by Richard Stanley, who did Dust Devil and Hardware. And I thought that was quite a good movie. That's worth checking out.
Yeah.
You do these things from time to time that work out a lot better than you think they're going to. I did a short film about a year ago called Don't Move, which you'll find on YouTube, which was written and directed by a very enterprising group of young people in the UK called Bloody Cuts, and they do short horror movies, and they asked me to do something for one of them, and I thought that was pretty great. The director for that was a huge Hellraiser film, although he was only about 12. As most people seem to be now, to me.
I was going to ask, what do you think about the show Face Off?
Well, to tell you the truth, I haven't watched a whole episode of it.
Yeah.
It's
conceptually, though, that these people are kind of who knows where they're from, and that they're competing, and the commercialization of the idea.
Yeah, well, it's it's no different to me. It's no different from the X Factor or any of those shows. It's only sort of half about the talent, and it's half about their story. A lot of the things that they're achievable in Face Off, I don't think are achievable in the same time frame in real life.
Mm-hmm.
But frankly, it's great that there's still that interest in makeup effects, I think, out there. That there's enough interest to support a television show, I guess, is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it seems the Stan Winston School, they put out some really interesting stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there's some fantastic stuff out there. I'm working for a company at the moment called Millennium Effects here in England, which is run by a guy called Neil Gorton, and he has a school here in England, and he does a range of DVDs and things that I so wish had been around when I was getting interested. There's so much great information out there for people who want to get into makeup effects. You really don't need to go to a school or anything like that. The information's all out there.
Yeah, when you were talking about shorts earlier, I kind of think that's becoming popular now, the short horror films. And then they also have the anthology films where they'll take a bunch of different shorts and put them together, like ABCs of Death and VHS. And would that, you said you enjoy doing that. Would that be something that you would like to do in the future?
Maybe. Just waking up in the mornings is an achievement at my age. I'd be happy just to do that.
You were mentioning that there's so much more information out there, and really there's so many more people that seem to be getting into art because there's a bigger emphasis on the ability and all these different jobs and with computers, and it seems like it's just so much more competitive. How difficult do you think it is to be a new person where it is a lot of the same stuff, and as you said, it's harder to be original? How hard is it for someone to get into this and actually make it?
I think if you really want to do it, then you'll probably end up doing it. But you, like any of these jobs, it's getting into it's one thing, staying in it's another. Mm-hmm. Certainly for makeup effects in England, if you're going to do it as a career, then it's you're generally going to have to be self-employed. It causes you all sorts of problems getting houses, getting loans for cars, things like that. Havoc with your social life. It's very difficult for people who aren't in movies to understand why you suddenly aren't going to be home that night. You can't go out for dinner with your friends or whatever. So it's something you have to be very dedicated to if you want to do it. But I honestly believe that if you do want to do it, then no one's going to put you off. I mean, I spent probably 3 years making stuff in my bedroom before anyone actually looked at my portfolio or considered giving me a job. But at no time during that time did I think, well, I'm going to give up and try and do something else. Mm-hmm. I've thought that a few times since. Right?
You brought up, there's still some people that love the like the practical effects, and I kind of think that's making a comeback like lately. They'll make a big
Absolutely.
deal.
I mean, I think a lot of directors have suddenly sort of looked at computer stuff and thought, well, it's kind of like the emperor's new clothes to a degree. A lot of people have suddenly looked at it and thought, well, he's got no clothes on, and that looks a bit shit. And you certainly get the feeling that people do wanna see stuff that's real there again. Definitely. I think a lot of it now is to do with the fact that CG's been around for a while, and people have got used to it and how it looks, and it's not as bright and sparkly as it was 10 years ago. People have started beginning to see the joins a little bit, maybe.
Do you think some of it is to do with some of the people making movies now grew up, or from an era where they grew up watching the movies from the 80s that had the practical effects, and now they would rather make something that, was more like emotionally attached to them?
Yeah, or remake them.
Yes, or remake them, right. I never quite understood that. If you really loved a movie, why you would want to I love this movie by so and so. I think I'll remake it, make it better. Well,
I think a lot of that is to do with the fact that to a certain extent, it's pre-sold. And also, you can say, well, people, the people who went to see, I don't know, the original Fright Night aren't going to be the same people who go and see the remake. It's made for a different generation of people. It's only sad people like us who are still watching horror movies.
It was actually one of the first interviews I did. It was 2006, and we had Adam Green on right when Hatchet was coming out, and I really liked the tagline of the movie. It was not a remake, not a sequel, not based off a Japanese movie. And I brought that up. I thought it was funny. And it turned out that was from an actual letter that he got that declined his movie. He sent to a studio. And that was the reason they gave him. It was an original movie, and so they didn't want to do it.
Right.
It was kind of sad, actually.
Yeah, well, it's, it's kind of the way things go.
Well, speaking of that...
You kind of... I think... I'll probably think about giving up when they finally get round to doing that Hellraiser remake that they've been talking about for the last 15 years.
I was just going to ask you about that. Do you think that's going to happen, or?
I'm sure at some point in the future it'll happen. Yeah, I'm sure it will. Now, in fact, I think one of the more hopeful things about it is that the last announcement I saw about it was that Clive had become involved in it. So
yeah,
that's always going to be a good thing as far as I'm concerned.
Do you think that can just rescue the movie? Do you think it's possible that it could be a good, solid film? Because I think that a lot of these original people really want to be a part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think it'll help. It doesn't always work.
Mm-hmm.
You can make Prometheus and.
Good point. Very good point.
Looks lovely.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah. Sometimes I thought we were the only people who didn't enjoy it. So.
Who did or didn't?
Did not. Yeah.
Did not.
Well, I enjoyed it, but for the wrong reasons, I think.
I could see that.
I did think it looked stunning, and obviously you expect that from Ridley.
Yeah. Now,
but there did seem to be a few lapses of reason in it.
Yeah, I think.
To put it politely.
Yes, lightly, exactly.
Yeah.
Like the ship acting as a donut, trying to mow people down as if they're Wile E. Coyote. It was.
Yeah, that was kind of cool, wasn't it?
No.
Yeah, I like the scientists just taking their helmets off and like,
Absolutely.
I can breathe
Well,
here.
you would, wouldn't you?
Yes, it reminded me of like an old like 50s sci-fi movie that was like really silly, where they would just like,
Yeah.
let me test the if they have air here.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh yeah, seems like something someone would do.
Let's go touch this thing.
Yes, we found an
Yeah,
alien. Let's go pet
Potentially
it.
dangerous.
You know, Alien's just it and Planet Terror mixed together, isn't it?
So I do want to bring up Channard's death in Hellbound, and I'd read in that previous interview that you had some like input on like how he would be his demise.
Yeah. Yeah. We wanted to do something that combined all those sort of elements of Channard. You know, the sort of stop motion thing with the hands, and I think Pete Atkins, the writer, said, well, it would be cool if he gets stuck somehow, something to do with his hands, and his head comes off. And I thought it would be kind of neat if he sort of split along his mouth and things like that. And there was a commercial in England at the time for Pizza Hut, and I always loved the way when they cut the pizza that everything sort of strung out. So I thought it would be neat if we filled Channard's head with lots of bubble gum. And we melted that just before the shot, so when his head comes off, it's sort of strung out like a pizza. I think you can see a bit of that in the finished film, but probably not as much as I intended.
That's gotta be fun when you're on set. Do you feel like a kid sometimes when you're filming something like that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's a silly job, isn't it? You know? You're getting paid to make monsters and kill people. I mean, you know.
Nick had said you guys were using like pieces of condoms and KY jelly to make his mouth look right.
Oh yeah, I mean that's kind of part of the course. Yeah, you always you always send the runner down for a 50-pack of condoms and yeah, and enough KY jelly to lubricate a whale. Yeah.
I wonder what the store thinks. Some guy's coming in just buying a bunch of condoms and like a big vat of lube. Yeah.
Well, one hell of a weekend.
Another night. Exactly.
There's a hell of a guy there. No, any current
and lots of bubble gum,
yes.
gum, condoms, and lube. It all works together.
Yeah, it's all good.
What any current projects you're working on? You'd like to mention?
The last movie that I did was a war movie called Fury, which is directed by a guy called David Ayer, starring Brad Pitt. That'll be out in about November, I think. A really good sort of violent war movie. If you like the first 20 minutes of Saving Private Ryan, this is a whole movie like that. So there's quite a lot of work on that. At the moment, I've just bunked off this afternoon from working on a project called Knife Man, which is a pilot for a TV series that AMC are doing. It's about a 18th century surgeon and about the sort of birth of surgery. So there's a lot of gruesome stuff in that, lots of body snatching and that sort of thing. So that'll be kind of cool too.
That sounds cool.
What would be an ideal project for you to work on? What would be like your dream project to be involved in? Even if you just make up something, not necessarily it could be a book or something like that you'd like to do.
Yeah, I still like making, I still like making rubber monsters. If someone says, "Yeah, we got a monster movie," that's always a good start. I don't know. I don't have any projects that I really love to do or love to see made. I guess if we're going back to Clive Barker stuff, I'd love them to make a movie of Weave World. I'd love to work on that. Still, I think one of my favorite Barker books. It will be cool to do something like that. I think. I'm I'm still a big Clive Barker fan. You know, I still read all the books religiously, and you know, to me, to be around Clive at that time that we made Hellraiser, you know, he was such an interesting person, and you know, had an opinion on everything, a very funny, dark sense of humor. You know, very sort of charismatic guy as well. So you know, it was a great time to be around then, and I'd certainly like to work on another Clive Barker thing.
Yeah, both Nick and Simon were saying that being around him was just it sounded just so influential.
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
just be near him as an artist, and that he was very friendly.
Yeah. I mean, he's you know, I haven't seen him for maybe 10 years or so, but at that time, you know, he was the nicest person imaginable, and just, you know, just someone you wanted to be your friend or your big brother or whatever.
Do you still keep in contact with him or anybody from the Hellraiser films?
Well, this last year or so, I've been meeting quite a lot of them again, because there's, you know, various Hellraiser documentaries being made and things like that.
Leviathan is a big project.
Yeah, I've seen you know, Jeff Portas, who used to run Image Animation with Bob Keane, quite a lot over the last few years. Nick Vince, I've seen quite a lot. A lot of the people who worked on Hellraiser are still working in effects, you know, and I still see them quite often on various projects. So yeah, there's you know, most of the people who worked on Hellraiser are still out there in some capacity. One of my best friends at the time in the makeup crew was a guy called Dave Elsey, who won an Oscar a couple of years ago with Rick Baker for Wolfman and things like that. I still see him. There was a great designer on Hellraiser called Paul Catling, who does a lot of designs did a lot of designs for Harry Potter movies and things like that. There was another guy called Julian Caldo, who again moved into designs, did a lot of fantastic designs on the Batman movies and things like that. You know, most of them are still out there and still doing cool stuff.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned, you know, Howling was a movie that, you know, made you want to do this. Have you ever gotten a chance to make a werewolf?
A werewolf? Yeah, I worked on a film called Waxwork again, which was soon after Hellraiser, actually, and we did a werewolf for that. And in fact, we were out in the States shooting that when Hellraiser came out, and I remember driving down Hollywood Boulevard and seeing the big pinhead posters everywhere and thinking, wow, that's kind of cool, I made it.
Yeah. Now, I know some other people who've done the effects and makeup. They will play some characters in the movies because they'll make the suit for themselves. Have you ever done that?
Yeah. Again, I think in Waxwork I was a zombie and and a golem and things like that. And I've done various other bits in the past, but yeah, I've done it occasionally. Being in a rubber suit's bloody hard work. It really is. I mean, you know, I'm in awe of the people who do it all the time. You know, people like Doug Jones and people like that.
Yeah.
Fantastic, really.
Mm-hmm. And you know, he said this is, you know, coming up on the 30th anniversary of Hellraiser.
Yeah.
What do you think it is about Hellraiser that has you know, kept it relevant all these years, and you know, people, and you mentioned people are 12, you know, like it, that, you know, all different generations like the film.
Yeah, I think the mythology of it is something that's very interesting to people. You know, it's not just a stalk and slasher movie. The fact that it deals with some quite dark sexual stuff, I think, is a big draw for people as well. It's interesting. I mean, I think that whole body piercing thing as well. I can remember when I was a lot younger. You know, you never saw people who were tattooed or people who were body pierced, and I think Hellraiser in some ways made all that a lot more acceptable.
Yeah. It was kind of ahead of its time.
Yeah, and it you look at it now and it still feels fresh and interesting, and I think, as I said before, I think the performances in it are so good. Not just from Doug and the Cenobites, but I think Claire Higgins' performance in it is stonking.
Yeah.
She comes across as a very frightening person to be around.
I mentioned the show this month was you don't really see the Cenobites a lot in the first movie, even though that's what you think of. But Frank's really kind of the main villain in the first.
The film really is about an obsessive love affair between Julia and Frank. I mean, the Cenobites are just the interesting set dressing, really.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that works, better for the movie?
I think you see enough of them.
Mm-hmm.
If you saw too much of them, then they suddenly become cartoonish. In much the same way as when you saw too much of Freddy in the Nightmare on Elm Street sequels, he just became a comedy character, really.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Even in the first one, he's pulling off a lot of silly lines.
Yeah.
But, yeah, absolutely. You can overkill it. It takes you from that.
In the later Hellraiser films, when Pinhead became a bit of a wisecracker. No.
I mentioned too. I don't think he's really portrayed as a really evil character till the third film. In the first two, he's almost neutral in a way.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right.
Well, we want to.
I think the fact that they're still, quite human in the first couple of films is kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just want to let everybody know that you have a website, and it's creature.effects.com. And what kind of stuff can people find on there?
Really stuff from all the movies that I've done over the last 30 years or so. And there's a lot of my personal art stuff on there as well, which, if you haven't seen, it's kind of interesting. It's not your run-of-the-mill horror stuff.
I really love your sculptures. I think they're fantastic. So
it's interesting that a lot of the time you get hired on jobs because of the personal stuff, but that's not really what they want to see for the movie.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a little frustrating.
Yeah, it seems kind of odd too. It's like, well, I really like this, but could you make something completely different?
Yeah. Yes.
Uh-huh. Do you have like a Twitter account or anything people can find you?
I don't. I'm not really very au fait with Twitter. I do have a Facebook account. I think I'm the only Cliff Wallace on there, so you can generally find me.
All right. Well, we appreciate you talking to us.
That's all right. My pleasure.
A real pleasure.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Cheers. They're fantastic.
How you doing? This is Lance Henriksen, and you're listening to WithoutYourHead.com.